Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Imagine yourself standing in the dim interior of a Sumerian temple, somewhere around 3200 BCE, in the ancient city of Uruk. The air hangs heavy with incense, frankincense and myrrh mixing with the earthy smell of wet clay and the faint metallic tang of bronze tools. Priests move silently through columned halls, their sandals whispering against polished stone floors. Outside, the Euphrates River flows past mud brick walls, carrying silt that will become next season's fields, next year's tablets, next millennium's archaeological treasures. You're witnessing the birth of writing itself, though of course you probably won't survive this. The heat alone in ancient Mesopotamia during summer could reach temperatures that would make modern air conditioning seem like humanity's greatest achievement, which, let's be honest, it absolutely is. The temple scribe sits cross-legged before you, a reed stylus in hand, pressing wedge-shaped marks into a soft clay tablet. He's recording something monumental, a story about the beginning of everything. Not just the beginning of Uruk, or Sumer, or even humanity, but the beginning of the cosmos itself, the time before time, when gods walked between heaven and earth as casually as you might walk between your bedroom and your kitchen at 2 a.m. looking for snacks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not holding your sleep hostage, though I suppose in a way I am your temporary intellectual captor for the next few hours. Speaking of which, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Are you in Tokyo at dawn, in Chicago at midnight, in London during that strange twilight hour when you're not sure if you should sleep or just power through? Drop a comment and let me know. I find it oddly comforting to imagine all of you scattered across time zones, unified only by an inexplicable desire to learn about ancient Sumerian cosmology while drifting off to sleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scribe before you is creating what we now call the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation narratives ever discovered. The tablet describes a time before cities existed, before the first temple was built, before the first king ruled. In this primordial era, the Anunnaki, a term that translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came, descend from the heavens to organize the chaotic world. Here's our first mainstream historical fact. The Anunnaki were indeed the primary gods of the Sumerian pantheon, described extensively in cuneiform texts from the 3rd millennium BCE onward, and they represented the celestial deities as opposed to the Igigi, who were often considered lesser gods or servants. Scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer and Thorkel Jacobson spent decades translating these texts, establishing that the Anunnaki functioned as a divine council that made decisions about the fate of humanity and the cosmos. They weren't a modern invention or a misinterpretation. They're right there in the clay, mentioned in ritual texts, prayers, king lists, and mythological narratives. But here's where things get delightfully weird, because no ancient civilization can be discussed without someone claiming aliens were involved. It's practically a law of the internet, right up there with cats being adorable and arguments about pineapple on pizza. The fringe interpretation comes from writers like Zecharia Sitchin, who in the 1970s proposed that the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings from a hypothetical planet called Nibiru, and that these aliens genetically engineered Homo sapiens to serve as a slave labor force in gold mines. According to this theory, the gods were simply advanced beings whose technology seemed magical to primitive humans, and all of Sumerian mythology is actually a literal historical account of alien contact. Mainstream scholars respond to this with the academic equivalent of a heavy sigh, the kind of sigh your high school history teacher made when someone asked if the pyramids were built by aliens. The linguistic and contextual evidence overwhelmingly supports reading these texts as mythology, as humanity's attempt to explain existence, suffering, order, and chaos through narrative. But Sitchin's book sold millions of copies, so clearly the alien interpretation scratches some psychological itch, perhaps our collective desire to believe we're not alone in the universe, or maybe just our suspicion that ancient people couldn't possibly have accomplished anything impressive without extraterrestrial intervention, which is frankly a bit insulting to ancient people. The scholarly debate we should touch on here concerns the very nature of these texts. Are they mythology, theology, history, or some blend of all three? Assyriologist Jean Bottero argued that Mesopotamian creation myths functioned primarily as etiological narratives, stories that explain why things are the way they are. Why do humans work? Because the gods created us to labor on their behalf. Why do we suffer? Because we're made from clay and the blood of a slain god, inheriting both earthly limitation and divine rebellion. Other scholars, like Wilfrid Lambert, emphasize the cultic and ritual functions of these texts, suggesting they were recited during New Year festivals to symbolically renew the cosmic order. The debate isn't whether these texts are true in a historical sense, no serious scholar argues that, but rather what kind of truth they contain and what function they served in Sumerian society. It's the difference between asking, "Did this happen?" and asking, "What did believing this do for the people who believed it?" One question is boring and easily answered. The other opens up fascinating insights into human psychology, power structures, and meaning-making. Let's return to our scribe in the temple. His fingers are stained with clay dust, and he pauses occasionally to dip his stylus in water, keeping the edge sharp. The tablet he's working on will be fired in a kiln, hardening it for eternity, or at least until some archaeologist 5,000 years later digs it up and argues about its meaning in a peer-reviewed journal. The narrative he records describes a time when the gods decide the world is too chaotic, too wild, too formless. The Anunnaki convene in assembly, a kind of divine congress, and they begin the work of creation through division and categorization. They separate heaven from earth, establish the firmament, set the celestial bodies in motion. It's remarkably similar to other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, the Enuma Elish from Babylon, the Egyptian creation narratives, even Genesis in the Hebrew Bible. All of them feature gods bringing order from chaos, speaking things into existence, establishing boundaries and hierarchies. Comparative mythology reveals that humans across cultures seem compelled to imagine that the universe was once formless and void, and that consciousness, divine consciousness, transformed it into the ordered cosmos we inhabit. Whether that says something profound about the human mind, or just about the human tendency to project our own psychology onto the universe is another debate entirely, though personally I suspect it's both, which is the most annoying possible answer because it means everyone's partly right. The temple where our scribe works is itself a representation of cosmic order. Sumerian temples, called ziggurats, were built as artificial mountains, staircases to heaven, physical manifestations of the connection between the earthly and divine realms. The largest ziggurat, the Atemenanki in Babylon, possibly the inspiration for the Tower of Babel story, rose about 91 meters tall, which doesn't sound that impressive until you remember it was built entirely from mud bricks by people who didn't have cranes, steel, or the ability to order supplies from Amazon Prime. The ziggurat's design reflects Sumerian cosmology: earth below, heaven above, and the temple as the axis mundi, the center point where the two realms meet. Priests climbed these structures in ritual processions, symbolically ascending to meet the gods, or perhaps more cynically, symbolically justifying their own elevated social position. Religion and politics have always been uncomfortably intertwined, like that couple at a party who can't stop touching each other and everyone's like, "We get it, you're in love, but could you not right now?" Now, the Anunnaki as described in these early texts aren't the benevolent creator figures you might expect from modern religious sensibilities. They're complex, capricious, sometimes cruel. They create humanity not out of love but out of need. They're tired of doing their own work, so they fashion servants from clay. It's a startlingly pragmatic creation myth. There's no grand cosmic purpose, no divine plan for human flourishing. We're basically celestial lawn mowers, created to maintain the garden so the gods can relax. If that sounds bleak, well, welcome to Sumerian theology. where the cosmic order is maintained through labor and sacrifice, and the best you can hope for is that the gods notice you're doing a good job and don't flood the entire world on a whim. Though to be fair, modern employment isn't that different. We're still hoping our bosses notice our work and don't arbitrarily eliminate our positions during the next round of corporate restructuring. The Sumerians just had the honesty to encode their labor anxieties into their religious cosmology. Here's a delightful detail. The word Anunnaki itself is linguistically fascinating. It breaks down into Anun, referring to the sky god An, and Ki, meaning earth, with the whole term suggesting offspring of An and earth, or those of royal blood. They're literally the aristocracy of the divine world, and like all aristocracies, they're mostly concerned with maintaining their privilege and ensuring the lower classes, humans and lesser gods, keep working. Sumerian society was highly stratified, with kings, priests, merchants, farmers, and slaves occupying distinct social positions, and their mythology reflects and reinforces this hierarchy. The gods are organized in a parallel hierarchy, with An at the top, followed by Enlil, the storm god, Enki, the god of wisdom and water, and various other deities managing different aspects of existence. Its cosmic bureaucracy, complete with jurisdictional disputes, political maneuvering, and the occasional divine tantrum. One ancient text describes the gods arguing about who has to do the work of maintaining the earth, and their solution is to create humans. Essentially, the gods unionized and then invented scabs to replace themselves. I'm not saying the Sumerians predicted labor relations, but I'm not saying it either. The mainstream historical understanding positions these myths within their proper context. Bronze Age Mesopotamia, a land of competing city-states, where political power was justified through divine mandate. Kings ruled because the gods chose them. Laws were legitimate because the gods decreed them. The social order was unchangeable because it mirrored the cosmic order. This isn't unique to Sumer. Nearly every ancient civilization used religion to sanctify political power. But the Sumerians were among the first to write it all down, preserving their ideology for millennia. The myths served practical functions. They explained natural phenomena. Why does the river flood? Because Enlil is angry. Justified suffering. Why is life hard? Because we're made to labor for the gods. And reinforced social hierarchies. Why do kings rule? Because they're chosen by the divine assembly. It's mythology as social technology, a tool for organizing large groups of people around shared narratives and values. But let's not forget our fringe friends, who look at phrases like, those who from heaven to earth came, and see spacecraft rather than metaphor. Sitchin and his followers point to Sumerian depictions of the gods, which sometimes show them with strange objects, possibly tools, possibly weapons, possibly, if you squint and really want to see it, technological devices. There are cylinder seals showing figures with what could be interpreted as helmets, or perhaps just elaborate ceremonial headgear. There are texts describing the gods traveling through the sky, which could be poetic descriptions of celestial movements, or, if you're committed to the alien hypothesis, literal accounts of flying vehicles. The problem with this interpretation isn't that it's impossible. Obviously, we can't definitively prove ancient aliens didn't visit Mesopotamia, but that it requires ignoring the overwhelming contextual evidence, the linguistic analysis, the comparative mythology, and the general principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The alien theory thrives on gaps in our knowledge, on the assumption that ancient people couldn't possibly have invented gods without some real-world inspiration, which frankly underestimates human imagination. We're the species that invented jazz, surrealism, and the Muppets. We can definitely invent gods without needing extraterrestrial help. The scholarly debate about these texts extends to questions of literary development. Did the Eridu Genesis develop over centuries, with different scribes adding layers of meaning? Were there earlier oral traditions that informed the written versions? How do we account for variations between different tablets of the same story? These aren't trivial questions. They get at fundamental issues of textual authority and historical reconstruction. When we read a Sumerian myth, are we accessing the original version, or are we reading one scribe's interpretation of a tradition that had already evolved over generations? Assyriologist Klaus Wilke has argued that many Sumerian literary texts show signs of being frozen at specific historical moments, preserved in scribal schools as educational texts long after the living tradition had evolved. So we might be reading the Bronze Age equivalent of a textbook. Authoritative, yes, but also potentially removed from the vibrant, changing oral traditions that preceded and surrounded it. It's like trying to understand modern storytelling by only reading grammar textbooks. You'll get something, but you'll miss the living, breathing messiness of actual narrative practice. Our scribe in the temple finishes his tablet and sets it aside to dry. Tomorrow it will be fired, and then it will join thousands of other tablets in the temple archive, a library of cosmic knowledge, legal codes, economic records, and mythological narratives. These archives weren't just storage spaces, they were centers of learning, where young scribes studied the ancient texts, copying them to preserve them, memorizing them to perpetuate the tradition. The cuneiform script itself, those wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, represents one of humanity's most significant cognitive achievements, the externalization of thought into permanent, transmissible form. Before writing, knowledge was embodied. It lived in people, was transmitted through speech and memory, and died when the knowledgeable died. After writing, knowledge became independent, could travel across space and time, could accumulate beyond any individual's capacity to remember. The Sumerian scribes who recorded these myths didn't know they were creating time capsules for people 5,000 years in the future, but that's exactly what they did. Though if we're being honest, they probably wouldn't be thrilled to know that their sacred cosmological narratives are now being used as sleep aids by people lying in bed staring at glowing rectangles. Sorry, ancient scribes, this is what immortality looks like, and it's weird. The night deepens around the temple. Outside, the city of Uruk sleeps. Well, some of it sleeps. There are night watchmen on the walls, bakers preparing tomorrow's bread, people nursing sick children, people unable to sleep because of anxiety about debt or drought or dynastic politics. The fundamental human experience hasn't changed much. We still worry, still wonder, still seek meaning in the darkness. The Anunnaki myths provided one answer to the big questions. Where did we come from? The gods made us. Why are we here? To serve. What happens when we die? We descend to the underworld, a grim realm of dust and shadows, where even kings become powerless shades. It's not exactly comforting, but it's coherent, and coherence matters when you're trying to make sense of existence. The Sumerians looked at their world, the regular flooding of rivers, the movement of stars, the rise and fall of cities, and constructed a narrative framework that made it all comprehensible. Were they right? Well, that depends on what you mean by right. Did their gods literally exist? Almost certainly not. Did their myths serve genuine psychological, social, and cultural functions? Absolutely. Sometimes the truth of a story isn't about factual accuracy, but about meaning, about the story's ability to help people navigate the terrifying complexity of being conscious in an often incomprehensible universe. Let's pause here for a moment and appreciate the sheer antiquity of what we're discussing. The myths we're exploring tonight were ancient when Homer composed the Odyssey. They were ancient when the pyramids were already crumbling tourist attractions in the Roman Empire. They were ancient when Jesus walked in Galilee, when Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, when Confucius offered his wisdom. The Anunnaki myths represent the deepest layer of recorded human thought, the foundational stories upon which later civilizations built their own narratives. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you're reading a story that influenced the biblical flood narrative. When you study Greek mythology, you're seeing ideas that were partially borrowed and transformed from Mesopotamian sources. When you examine modern conspiracy theories about ancient aliens, you're witnessing the latest iteration of humanity's endless fascination with the distant past and its mysteries. We're all downstream from Sumer, whether we realize it or not. Their inventions, writing, mathematics, astronomy, organized religion, urban planning, bureaucracy, form the scaffolding of modern civilization. We're still using base 60 mathematics when we measure time and angles, a direct inheritance from Sumerian number systems. We're still organizing knowledge in hierarchical categories, a cognitive habit inherited from the way Sumerian scribes organized their tablet archives. We're still telling stories about gods and heroes to make sense of suffering and injustice, even if we now call them comic book movies and prestige television dramas. The fringe interpretations, for all their scholarly problems, do highlight one interesting question. Why are ancient myths so often concerned with beings descending from the sky? The Anunnaki come from heaven. Greek gods live on Mount Olympus. Norse gods inhabit Asgard above the world tree. Angels descend from heaven in Abrahamic traditions. There's a persistent cross-cultural pattern of associating divinity with the sky, with height, with the above. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. The sky is vast, eternal, unreachable, mysterious. Of course, it becomes the dwelling place of gods. Height equals power in human psychology. We look up to leaders. We talk about climbing social ladders. We use vertical spatial metaphors for status. The fringe explanation is that these myths preserve memories of actual beings who arrived from the sky, i.e., from space. It's a less elegant explanation because it requires introducing elements, aliens, advanced technology, interstellar travel, for which we have zero independent evidence, but it's not logically impossible. However, impossibility and implausibility are different things. It's not impossible that invisible unicorns are reading this script over your shoulder right now, but it's wildly implausible, and we generally prefer explanations that don't multiply entities unnecessarily. This is Occam's razor, the philosophical principle that simpler explanations are generally preferable to more complex ones, which is a fancy way of saying, don't make things weirder than they need to be, which is good advice for both ancient mythology and modern life. Scholarly debates about the Anunnaki also touch on the relationship between mythology and historical memory. Can myths preserve genuine historical information, encoded in symbolic form? Some scholars argue yes. Flood myths, for instance, might preserve cultural memories of actual catastrophic flooding events. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis suggests that the biblical flood narrative could be based on the rapid flooding of the Black Sea basin around 5600 BCE, an event that would have displaced thousands of people and left a lasting impression on regional cultures. If that's true, then myths aren't pure fiction. Their history filtered through narrative, embellished and theologized, but retaining a kernel of truth. Other scholars are skeptical, arguing that this approach cherry-picks correlations and ignores the fundamentally literary and symbolic nature of mythological narratives. Just because a myth mentions a flood doesn't mean it's describing a specific historical flood. It might just be using flooding, a common and terrifying natural occurrence, as a narrative device. We humans love finding patterns, sometimes even when no patterns exist. It's why we see faces in clouds, hear messages in static, and convince ourselves that the ancient alien's guy's hair is a deliberate fashion choice rather than a cry for help. The temple scribe from our opening scene would probably find all of this debate amusing or perhaps horrifying. He wasn't writing science fiction or history textbooks. He was recording sacred truth, the foundational reality of his cosmos. The Anunnaki weren't hypothetical or metaphorical to him. They were as real as the Euphrates River, as real as the barley in the fields, as real as the king who ruled from the palace. This is worth remembering when we engage with ancient texts. The people who wrote them and the people who believed them weren't primitive or gullible. They were humans exactly like us, with the same cognitive capacities, the same emotional range, the same desperate need to understand why we're here and what it all means. They just had different tools, different information, different cultural frameworks. If we'd been born in ancient Uruk, we'd probably believe in the Anunnaki too. If they were born in the modern world, they'd probably be arguing about string theory, or the multiverse, or whether consciousness can be reduced to neurological processes. The questions remain constant, only the vocabulary changes. As we close this first section, picture yourself back in that temple, watching the scribe work. The oil lamps flicker, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Somewhere, a priest chants prayers to Inanna, goddess of love and war. The smell of incense mingles with the earthy scent of clay and the sharp tang of the reeds used for writing. You're witnessing the moment when human thought becomes permanent, when the ephemeral becomes eternal. The Anunnaki myths being recorded on these tablets will outlast empires, will survive the fall of Sumer itself, will be buried in sand for millennia before being excavated and translated and debated and, yes, turned into bedtime stories for insomniacs in the 21st century. There's something profound in that continuity, in the way human stories persist even as civilizations crumble. We tell stories because we're mortal and we know it, and stories are our way of cheating death, our way of sending messages to the future. The Sumerian scribes are long dead, but their words survive, and in a very real sense, that means they've achieved immortality. Not the literal eternal life they hoped the gods might grant, but something almost as good, the knowledge that thousands of years later, someone somewhere is still thinking about their ideas, still grappling with the questions they grappled with, still finding meaning in the stories they told. If that's not a kind of victory over death, I don't know what is. We descend now into deeper time, into the period the Sumerians called the antediluvian age, the time before the great flood swept away the old world and necessitated the creation of the new. This is where history, mythology, and chronology become hopelessly entangled, like headphone cords in a pocket, except instead of just being annoying, it's actually academically fascinating. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important cuneiform documents ever discovered, begins its chronology with a stunning claim. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. Eridug, or Eridu, is considered the oldest city in Sumer, the first place where civilization emerged from the chaos of prehistory. But here's where things get wonderfully weird. The king list then proceeds to describe the reigns of the first kings, and these reigns last for thousands of years. We're not talking about long-lived monarchs who made it into their 80s. We're talking about kings who allegedly ruled for 28,800 years, 36,000 years, even 43,200 years. Either the Sumerians had a very different understanding of calendrical time, or someone was exaggerating on their resume, which honestly would make ancient kings remarkably similar to modern job applicants. Here's our mainstream historical fact for this section. The Sumerian king list is a genuine ancient document, likely compiled during the Ur III period around 2100 BCE, though it draws on older traditions and sources. Multiple copies have been found, with variations between them, suggesting it was an important text that circulated widely and was copied by scribal schools. Scholars like Thorkild Jacobson have analyzed the king list extensively, arguing that it served primarily as a political document, a way for later kings to legitimize their rule by connecting themselves to an unbroken line of divinely sanctioned kingship stretching back to the moment when kingship itself descended from heaven. The astronomical reign lengths of the antediluvian kings are generally understood by scholars not as literal chronology, but as symbolic expressions of the sacred primordial nature of early kingship. These aren't meant to be historical records in the modern sense. They're meant to convey the idea that early kings were semi-divine, closer to the gods, operating in a different temporal reality than ordinary mortals. It's the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of saying once upon a time, a narrative marker that signals we've entered mythological space rather than historical time. But of course, there's a fringe interpretation, because when has a list of impossibly long-lived ancient kings not attracted fringe interpretations? Some alternative historians argue that these reign lengths should be taken literally, or at least semi-literally, suggesting that antediluvian humans had much longer lifespans, possibly due to environmental conditions, a supposed vapor canopy that protected early Earth from cosmic radiation, genetic differences. We were closer to our perfect created state before genetic degradation set in, or, wait for it, extraterrestrial intervention. The Anunnaki genetically engineered early humans with extended lifespans. This interpretation often draws parallels with the biblical patriarchs in Genesis, who also lived for hundreds of years. Methuselah allegedly made it to 969 years old, which if true means he spent roughly 200 years being annoyed at young people and complaining about how things were better in his day. The problem with taking these numbers literally is, well, everything we know about biology, geology, archaeology, and physics. There's no evidence humans ever had significantly longer lifespans than we do now. If anything, the opposite is true. Ancient skeletons show that most people were lucky to make it past 40, and those who did were probably dealing with arthritis, dental problems, and parasites, not celebrating their 800th birthday with a big party. The scholarly debate here centers on what these numbers mean and how we should interpret them. One school of thought, represented by scholars like Piotr Michalowski, suggests that the Sumerians used different mathematical systems for different purposes, and these astronomical numbers might reflect some kind of sexagesimal calculation or symbolic numerology that we don't fully understand. Base 60 mathematics was fundamental to Sumerian culture. It's why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour, and it's possible that the reign lengths are the product of complex numerical operations rather than straightforward year counts. Another interpretation, proposed by researchers like Barton, is that these numbers represent regnal years calculated using a different calendar system, perhaps one based on lunar cycles rather than solar years, which would make the numbers somewhat smaller but still implausibly large. A third approach suggests that the numbers are purely symbolic, possibly related to astronomical cycles or sacred numerology, with no attempt at historical accuracy. Scholars point out that the reign lengths often conform to significant numbers in Sumerian mathematics and cosmology. Multiples of 3600 are Shah, a significant unit in their number system, for instance. It's like if modern rulers claim to have reigned for exactly 1 million days or 10 billion seconds. The suspiciously round numbers hint at symbolic rather than literal meaning. Let's paint the scene. Imagine you're in the scribal school at Nipper around 2000 BCE. You're a young apprentice scribe, sitting cross-legged on a reed mat, surrounded by older students all copying the same texts. Your master, an elderly scribe with ink-stained fingers and the patient exasperation of someone who's explained the difference between wedge orientations 1,000 times, walks between the rows checking your work. On the tablet before you, you're copying the king list, carefully pressing each cuneiform sign into soft clay. The room smells of damp earth and sweat. It's hot, always hot, and the clay has to be kept moist or it becomes unworkable. Your hand cramps from holding the stylus at the correct angle, and you've already made 2 mistakes that you had to smooth over and redo. When you reach the section describing Alulim, the first king, who reigned in Eridu for 28,800 years, you pause. Does this make sense? You wonder. Could someone really live that long? But you don't question it aloud. That's not how education works here. You memorize, you copy, you internalize the tradition. Critical thinking is for philosophers and priests, not for student scribes trying to master a difficult writing system. Plus, your teacher already smacked your knuckles with a stylus once today for sloppy cuneiform, and you'd really rather not give him another excuse. The antediluvian period described in these texts is fascinating because it represents a kind of golden age mythology common to many cultures. There was a time, the story goes, when everything was better. Kings were wiser, people lived longer, the gods were more present in daily life. Then something happened, usually a catastrophe, often a flood, and the old world ended. What followed was our world, diminished, fallen, mortal. This narrative structure appears in Greek mythology, the Golden Age before the successive ages of silver, bronze, and iron; in Hindu cosmology, the Satya Yuga before the progressive degradation through Treta, Dvapara, and Kali Yugas; in Norse mythology, the age before Ragnarok; and yes, in biblical tradition, the pre-fall Eden. It's almost as if humans are psychologically predisposed to believe that the past was better than the present, that we're living in decline, that our ancestors had access to wisdom and virtue we've lost. Whether this reflects genuine cultural memory of some prehistoric golden age or just the universal human tendency toward nostalgia is, well, yet another debate. Personally, I suspect it's nostalgia combined with the psychological comfort of believing that suffering and limitation are aberrations rather than the fundamental human condition, but I'm also the kind of person who finds comfort in listening to ancient Sumerian mythology before bed, so perhaps I'm not the best judge of psychological normalcy. Here's a delightful detail from the king list. After listing the antediluvian kings and their impossibly long reigns, it simply states, "Then the flood swept over." That's it. No explanation, no theological justification, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement that the entire world was destroyed and everything had to start over. It's remarkably understated for describing a global apocalypse, like saying, "Then I had a bad day at work," when you actually mean, "The entire building burned down and I lost my job." After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again, because apparently the first round of divine kingship wasn't sufficient, and we get a new list of kings. But notice something interesting. The post-flood kings have much shorter reigns, still longer than realistic human lifespans, but we've gone from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, or even just decades. It's as if whoever compiled the king list understood that they needed to gradually transition from mythological time to historical time, from the realm of gods and heroes to the realm of actual human history. The reigns get progressively shorter as we move forward in time, until eventually we're in the range of plausible human lifespans and we can start correlating the king list with archaeological evidence and other historical sources. The mainstream scholarly consensus is that the antediluvian section of the king list is purely mythological. It's theological prehistory, not history. The kings listed didn't exist as historical individuals. They're legendary figures whose function is to establish the divine origin of kingship itself. The impossibly long reigns emphasize their otherworldly nature, their proximity to the gods, their existence in a different order of reality than ordinary mortals. This interpretation is supported by the fact that we have zero archaeological evidence for any of these antediluvian kings or cities. No palaces, no royal tombs, no inscriptions mentioning Alulim or Alulgar or any of the others. If kings really ruled for tens of thousands of years, you'd expect to find some evidence of their reigns, but there's nothing. The earliest archaeological evidence for Sumerian civilization dates to around 4000 BCE, and even that's generous. The idea that organized kingship existed 30,000 or 40,000 years ago is contradicted by everything we know about human prehistory. At that point, humans were still hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, not building cities or establishing dynasties. Agriculture itself only emerged around 10,000 BCE and cities around 4000 BCE. You can't have kings without cities, and you can't have cities without agriculture, so the whole timeline collapses under even minimal scrutiny. But let's give the fringe interpretation its moment in the sun, because it's nothing if not creative. Proponents point to the fact that flood myths are nearly universal across human cultures. The Sumerians have their flood story, the Hebrews have Noah, the Greeks have Deucalion, the Indians have Manu, the Chinese have Gunyu, the Mesoamericans have multiple flood narratives. Surely, the argument goes, this can't be coincidence. There must have been an actual global flood, and these myths preserve memories of it. Furthermore, the consistent mention of antediluvian long lifespans across different cultures, Sumerian kings, biblical patriarchs, etc., suggests these aren't independent inventions but memories of a real period when humans lived longer. The explanation usually involves some combination of pre-flood environmental conditions, again that hypothetical vapor canopy, genetic purity, we hadn't yet accumulated deleterious mutations, or alien genetics, we were hybrids of extraterrestrial and terrestrial DNA. It's elaborate, I'll give it that. The problem is that it requires ignoring vast swaths of evidence and introducing ad hoc hypotheses for which we have no independent support. Occam's razor suggests a simpler explanation. Floods are terrifying and culturally significant events, especially in river valleys where civilization first emerged, so of course cultures develop flood myths. The myths share similarities because they're addressing similar psychological and ecological realities, not because they're describing the same literal event. The scholarly debate extends to questions about the composition and purpose of the king list. Was it compiled all at once, or was it gradually assembled from disparate sources over time? Different copies of the king list show variations. Some include kings or cities that others omit. Some give different reign lengths for the same kings. This suggests a fluid textual tradition rather than a single authoritative version. Gerald Cooper has argued that the king list should be read as political propaganda, a document created to legitimize the Ur III dynasty by demonstrating that legitimate kingship could only exist in one place at a time. always in an unbroken line stretching back to divine origins. Earlier city-states often claimed simultaneous kingship, which created political complications. How can you claim to be the divinely ordained ruler if some other city-state is making the same claim? The king list solves this by imposing a linear chronology. Kingship moves from city to city, but it never exists in multiple places simultaneously. It's a clever rhetorical move, using the authority of ancient tradition to settle contemporary political disputes. Though to be fair, using ancient texts to justify current politics is hardly unique to Sumer. We're still doing it today, except now we argue about constitutional interpretation and original intent rather than which city-state the gods currently favor. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of claiming your king is divinely ordained because he's part of an unbroken lineage stretching back 241,200 years, the total of all antediluvian reigns according to one version of the king list. Modern politicians can barely claim legitimacy based on last week's election results, and here are the Sumerians asserting that their current ruler is the inheritor of kingship that literally descended from heaven at the beginning of time. It's magnificent as propaganda. How do you argue against that? You can't exactly produce archaeological evidence disproving a claim about events that allegedly occurred before the flood, because the flood conveniently destroyed all the evidence. It's unfalsifiable, which makes it perfect for legitimizing power. The gods chose our king, the tradition stretches back to creation, the cosmic order supports our rule, end of discussion. If you disagree, you're not just opposing a political leader, you're opposing the divine order of the universe itself. It's the ancient equivalent of, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed, except it's, I'm not oppressing you, the gods are disappointed in your rebellion. Power always seeks to naturalize itself, to make its contingent historical existence seem inevitable and divinely ordained, and the Sumerians were masters of this art. Now, the flood itself, the event that ends the antediluvian period, requires its own attention. The Sumerian flood myth, preserved in texts like the Eridu Genesis and the Atrahasis epic, describes the gods deciding to destroy humanity through a great deluge. The reasons vary depending on the version. Sometimes humans are too noisy and disturb the gods' sleep. Relatable content from the gods, honestly. Sometimes humanity has become too numerous and threatening. Sometimes it's just divine caprice. One god, usually Enki, warns a righteous man. Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Atrahasis in the Akkadian version, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, to build a boat and save himself, his family, and representatives of all animals. The flood comes, destroys everything, and when it recedes, the survivor makes offerings to the gods, who realize they've made a mistake because now nobody is around to feed them through sacrifices. The gods grant the survivor immortality and establish a new covenant with humanity. Sound familiar? It's essentially the Noah story, but predating the biblical version by over 1,000 years. The mainstream interpretation is that both the Sumerian and biblical flood narratives are etiological myths drawing on common Near Eastern motifs, possibly inspired by real flooding events in Mesopotamia, but not describing a literal global flood. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly and catastrophically, destroying cities and killing thousands. A particularly devastating flood could easily be remembered as the flood, the archetypal disaster against which all others are measured. The myths serve multiple functions. They explain the origin of current conditions, why kingship exists, why humans are mortal, why we must work and sacrifice. They provide moral instruction, the righteous are saved while the wicked perish, and they reinforce theological principles. The gods are powerful and capricious. Human life is precarious. Survival depends on divine favor. These are powerful stories that encode important cultural wisdom, but that doesn't make them historical. After all, the Harry Potter books contain real wisdom about friendship, courage, and the dangers of fascism, but that doesn't mean Hogwarts is a real place, much as we might wish otherwise. The fringe interpretation, predictably, involves taking the flood story literally and trying to find geological evidence for it. Young Earth creationists argue that Noah's flood explains various geological features, sedimentary layers, the fossil record, the Grand Canyon, you name it. They're essentially trying to compress billions of years of geological history into a single catastrophic event 4,000 years ago, which requires ignoring radiometric dating, stratigraphic analysis, plate tectonics, and pretty much all of geology. Other alternative researchers focus on different flood candidates: the Black Sea deluge, the flooding of the Persian Gulf, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, or even the end of the last ice age and the resulting sea level rise. Some of these events actually happened and could plausibly have influenced cultural memories and myths, but the jump from "there was significant flooding in prehistory" to the Sumerian king list is historically accurate about antediluvian kings ruling for tens of thousands of years is a logical chasm that no amount of creative interpretation can bridge. It's like saying there was a historical King Arthur, possibly. Therefore, Merlin was a real wizard and Excalibur really was a magical sword. No. Myths can be inspired by historical events without being historical documents. Back in our scribal school at Nippur, you're finishing your copy of the antediluvian section. Your hand aches, and you're fairly certain you've misspelled at least 3 royal names, but you're done. Your master examines your work with a critical eye, pointing out a wedge that's oriented incorrectly, a sign that's too shallow, but overall he nods approval. "Good," he says. "Now copy it again." Because that's how learning works in the ancient world. Endless repetition until the muscle memory is so deep you could write these signs in your sleep. In a way, you're not just learning to write, you're internalizing the worldview these texts encode. By copying the king list over and over, you're absorbing the idea that kingship is divinely ordained, that history is linear and purposeful, that the gods intervene in human affairs, that your civilization sits at the center of cosmic significance. Education is never ideologically neutral. It always transmits values along with information, and the Sumerian scribal schools were very much in the business of producing literate bureaucrats who believed in the divine right of kings and the eternal truth of the established order. Though again, modern education isn't that different. We just have different orthodoxies and call them critical thinking skills or civic values instead of the divine order of the cosmos. There's something poignant about the antediluvian myths when you really sit with them. They encode a deep human anxiety, the knowledge that everything we build can be swept away, that catastrophe is always possible, that the world we know is fragile and contingent. The Sumerians lived with this knowledge viscerally. Their cities were regularly threatened by floods, droughts, invasions, and famines. The antediluvian myths acknowledge this precarity while also providing comfort. Yes, the world was destroyed once, but it was rebuilt. Yes, the old order ended, but a new order emerged. Life continues, kingship is re-established, the gods remain engaged with human affairs. It's disaster mythology, but also resilience mythology. Things fall apart, and then we put them back together. The flood doesn't mean the end of meaning or order, it means the end of one world and the beginning of another. There's something almost hopeful in that, in the stubborn insistence that even after the worst happens, we can start again. As this section draws to a close, imagine standing on the banks of the Euphrates at dawn, watching the sun rise over the mudflats and reed beds. The river is calm now, but you can see the high water marks on the walls of the city, reminders of past floods. An old farmer passes by, leading a donkey loaded with barley. He nods to you, and you wonder what stories he carries, what memories of flood and drought and harvest his family has passed down through generations. The scribes may write the official histories, but ordinary people have their own traditions, their own understanding of the past. Somewhere, carved into clay and filed in a temple archive, the antediluvian kings reign for impossible spans of time, monuments to a mythological past that never was, but that feels true in some deeper sense, and maybe that's enough. Maybe the point isn't whether Alulim really ruled for 28,800 years. The point is that his name endures, that the story survives, that thousands of years later we're still talking about the kings before the flood and what they might mean. In a universe where everything is temporary and death is certain, that kind of immortality isn't nothing. It's not literal eternal life, but it's the closest thing we've got. The immortality of stories, the persistence of names, the way human meaning outlasts individual human lives. We ascend now from the flooded remnants of the antediluvian world to examine the organized cosmos that emerged afterward, specifically the divine assembly, the Anunnaki in their full hierarchical glory, arranged in a cosmic bureaucracy that would make any modern government office jealous of its organizational complexity. The Mesopotamian pantheon wasn't a chaotic collection of gods doing whatever they pleased. It was a structured hierarchy with clear roles, responsibilities, jurisdictional boundaries, and yes, probably committee meetings that could have been emails. The supreme god, An, or Anu in Akkadian, rules from the highest heaven, remote and somewhat inactive in day-to-day affairs, like a CEO who's mostly concerned with quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. Below him sits Enlil, the king of the gods in practical terms, the god of wind and storms who actually makes decisions and exercises power. Enki, Ea in Akkadian, the god of wisdom and water, serves as the clever problem solver, the divine engineer who handles the technical challenges the other gods can't manage. Then there's Inanna, Ishtar, goddess of love and war, who frankly seems to have more personality and agency than any of the male gods, which either reflects some fascinating gender dynamics in Sumerian culture or just proves that Inanna's cult was politically powerful enough to ensure she got good press in the mythological narratives. Here's our mainstream historical fact for this section. The Mesopotamian divine hierarchy reflects the social and political organization of Sumerian city-states, with gods representing different aspects of nature and civilization, organized in family relationships and power structures that mirror earthly kingdoms. Scholars like Thorkild Jacobsen have extensively documented how Mesopotamian theology evolved from primitive animism to organized polytheism, with gods becoming increasingly anthropomorphic and hierarchical as society itself became more complex. The divine assembly, called the Purim in Sumerian, functions like a royal council where major decisions are debated and decreed. This isn't unique to Mesopotamia. We see divine councils in Ugaritic religion, the Assembly of El, in Hebrew texts, the divine council presided over by Yahweh in Job and Psalms, and in Greek mythology, the Council of the Olympians. It's a common theological structure because it maps onto familiar political structures. Humans organize themselves into hierarchies, so of course they imagine the gods do the same. The gods aren't just powerful individuals, they're a government, complete with legislative bodies, executive functions, and presumably divine bureaucrats filing celestial paperwork. The fringe interpretation, and you knew this was coming, suggests that the divine hierarchy described in Sumerian texts is actually a description of an extraterrestrial command structure. The Anunnaki, according to this theory, weren't gods but aliens, and their hierarchical organization reflects the actual organizational structure of an advanced spacefaring civilization. Anu is the planetary sovereign, Enlil is the mission commander on Earth, Enki is the chief scientist, and the various other deities represent different departments: mining operations, genetic engineering, agricultural development, etc. Proponents point to the very concrete, practical nature of the gods' concerns. They need food, they get angry when humans are noisy, they have jurisdictional disputes, as evidence that these aren't abstract spiritual beings but physical entities with physical needs. The problem with this interpretation is that it's based on reading ancient metaphors literally and ancient poetry as bureaucratic documentation, which is roughly equivalent to reading "My love is like a red, red rose" and concluding that the poet's girlfriend was actually a flowering plant. Gods having human-like concerns is called anthropomorphism, and it's a universal feature of polytheistic religions. Humans understand the world through human categories, so we project human qualities onto everything from gods to pets to cars. Just because the Sumerian gods act like humans doesn't mean they were humans or aliens. It means the Sumerians were humans writing about divine beings using the only conceptual framework available to them. The scholarly debate in this area focuses on questions of divine function and evolution. How did the Mesopotamian pantheon develop over time? Earlier Sumerian religion seems to have featured more localized deities associated with specific cities: Inanna with Uruk, Enki with Eridu, Nanna with Ur. As these city-states came into contact, competed and sometimes merged, their pantheons had to be integrated, which led to increasingly complex theological elaborations. Gods were arranged into family trees. Enki and Ninki are parents to Nanshi and Ningirsu, who are parents to other gods, etc., which serve to organize the pantheon and explain relationships between cities and their tutelary deities. Mark Smith and other scholars have documented similar processes in the development of Israelite monotheism, where an originally polytheistic religion gradually elevated one god, Yahweh, above others until the others disappeared entirely. Religion isn't static. It evolves in response to political, social, and cultural pressures, which is fascinating if you're interested in how human meaning-making systems develop, and slightly inconvenient if you're trying to argue that these texts are literal accounts of historical events. Picture yourself in the great temple of Enlil at Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, around 2500 BCE. The temple complex sprawls across several acres, a small city within a city, with courtyards, chapels, storerooms, workshops, and administrative buildings. The air is thick with incense, cedar, juniper, and frankincense burning in bronze braziers. Priests in white linen robes move through the complex performing daily rituals, feeding the god, offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fruit placed before the cult statue, washing the god, dressing the god in fine garments. You're witnessing the care and feeding of divine beings, a practice that makes perfect sense if you believe gods are real entities with real needs, and makes somewhat less sense if you're a modern person who understands that cult statues are just statues. The priests themselves probably occupied some ambiguous middle ground, understanding on one level that they're performing symbolic rituals while also believing on another level that the god really is present in the statue, really does consume the offerings in some spiritual sense, really does need human service. Religion operates on multiple registers simultaneously, literal and metaphorical, material and spiritual, and trying to sort it into neat categories probably misses the point. The temple to Enlil isn't just a religious site, it's an economic powerhouse. The temple owns vast tracts of land, employs hundreds of workers, collects taxes and tithes from across the region. The priests aren't just spiritual leaders, they're administrators, accountants, landlords, judges. They manage irrigation systems, settle disputes, maintain granaries, organize trade expeditions. The divine hierarchy mirrors and legitimizes the earthly hierarchy, with the high priest serving as Enlil's earthly representative, exercising authority that's supposedly derived from the god, but that works out in practice to mean the priest controls significant wealth and power. This isn't cynical, or not entirely cynical. The priests probably genuinely believed they were serving the god and maintaining cosmic order, but belief and power have always been intimately connected, and religious institutions have always served both spiritual and political functions. The temple feeds the poor, sometimes, but it also enriches the priestly class and reinforces the existing social hierarchy. Religion is complicated, is what I'm saying, and anyone who tries to reduce it to either just power structures or pure spirituality is missing half the picture. Now let's talk about the Anunnaki specifically as a group. The term appears in countless Sumerian and Akkadian texts, but its exact meaning and scope shifts depending on context. Sometimes it refers to all the great gods collectively. Sometimes it refers specifically to the 7 judges of the underworld. Sometimes it seems to designate celestial gods as opposed to chthonic ones, or senior gods as opposed to junior ones. This ambiguity has frustrated scholars and delighted fringe theorists, because ambiguity leaves room for interpretation, and interpretation leaves room for creative readings that wouldn't survive if the texts were clearer. The mainstream scholarly position is that Anunnaki was a somewhat flexible term, like how the administration can refer to different groups of people depending on whether you're talking about the executive branch broadly or specific cabinet members specifically. Words don't always have single precise meanings. They have semantic ranges, and context determines which meaning is operative in a given instance. This is how language works, and ancient Sumerian is no exception. The fringe position is that the ambiguity is intentional obfuscation, that later scribes deliberately obscured the true nature of the Anunnaki to hide the fact that they were extraterrestrials. This requires believing in a conspiracy of silence spanning thousands of years, maintained by scribes across different cities and different millennia, all committed to concealing the truth about humanity's alien creators. It's an elaborate theory, but it runs into the same problem all conspiracy theories face. Conspiracies are hard to maintain because people talk, records survive, contradictions emerge. If there really was a Sumerian conspiracy to hide the alien nature of the Anunnaki, we'd expect to find dissenting texts, whistleblower tablets, scribal exposés. Instead, we find exactly what we'd expect if the Anunnaki were gods in a traditional religious sense: ritual texts, myths, prayers, hymns, all treating them as divine beings worthy of worship and service. The simplest explanation is that they were gods, described with the linguistic fluidity typical of ancient religious texts, worshipped by people who genuinely believed in them, and recorded by scribes who were preserving religious traditions rather than covering up alien contact. There's a scholarly debate about whether the Anunnaki represent a distinct group of gods or whether the term eventually became synonymous with gods in general. Lambert and other Assyriologists have traced the usage of the term across different periods and noted shifts in meaning. In earlier texts, the Anunnaki seem more distinct, possibly associated specifically with the earth or underworld. In later texts, especially in Akkadian sources, the term becomes more generic. This kind of semantic drift is completely normal in religious vocabulary. Think about how saint originally meant any Christian believer, but gradually narrowed to mean officially recognized holy people, or how martyr originally meant witness, but came to specifically mean someone killed for their faith. Language evolves, especially religious language, and the evolution of the term Anunnaki tells us something about how Mesopotamian religion changed over time, reflecting political changes, theological developments, and cross-cultural influences as Sumerian culture interacted with Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures. Let's take a moment to appreciate Inanna Ishtar, because honestly, she's the most interesting deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon and doesn't get enough credit in these discussions, which tend to focus on the male gods, because patriarchy apparently extends even to how we talk about ancient religion. Inanna is the goddess of love, sex, fertility, and war, which is a fascinating combination of domains and suggests something profound about how the Sumerians understood the relationship between creation and destruction, between Eros and Thanatos. She's also one of the few deities who successfully descends to the underworld and returns, making her a goddess of transformation and renewal. Her myths are wild. She seduces men and then destroys them. She starts wars because she's bored. She steals the fundamental powers of civilization, from Enki while he's drunk and refuses to give them back. She's transgressive, powerful, sexual, violent, and completely unapologetic about any of it. In a pantheon full of staid, dignified male authority figures, Inanna is chaos incarnate, and the Sumerians loved her for it. Her cult was enormous, her temples wealthy, her festivals elaborate. There's something refreshing about a culture that worships a goddess who embodies both creation and destruction, love and war, order and chaos, and doesn't try to reconcile these contradictions, but just accepts them as fundamental aspects of existence. The divine assembly operates through deliberation and decree. When major decisions need to be made, whether to flood the earth, whether to grant kingship to a particular city, whether to allow a mortal hero to achieve immortality, the gods convene in assembly, debate the issue, and reach a decision. The process is described in legal and political language borrowed from human assemblies and councils, which tells us something about how the Sumerians understood divine governance. The gods aren't arbitrary or chaotic in their decision-making. They follow procedures, consider arguments, operate within structures. It's divine constitutional monarchy, essentially, with An as the nominal sovereign but Enlil as the prime minister who actually runs things, and various other gods serving as ministers with specific portfolios. This hierarchical organization serves important theological functions. It explains why bad things happen, the gods debated it and reached a decision. It legitimizes earthly political structures, as above, so below, and it provides a framework for prayer and sacrifice. If you want to influence divine decisions, you need to petition the right God, make the right offerings, perform the right rituals. The fringe interpretation sees this as evidence of alien governance structures, possibly even as a record of actual council meetings between extraterrestrial commanders. Why else would the gods need to debate and reach decisions? If they're omnipotent, why the bureaucracy? But this objection misunderstands how polytheistic religions work. The gods aren't omnipotent, that's a monotheistic concept. Polytheistic gods are powerful, but limited, each with specific domains and powers. They need to cooperate because no single god controls everything. The assembly structure reflects this theological understanding. The cosmos is complex and requires multiple powers working together, or sometimes against each other, to function. It's actually a more sophisticated theology in some ways than simple omnipotent monotheism, because it better reflects the complexity and plurality of existence. The universe doesn't seem like it's controlled by a single all-powerful will. It seems like it's the product of multiple forces, sometimes cooperating, sometimes conflicting, sometimes achieving balance and sometimes descending into chaos. Polytheism, whatever its factual truth or lack thereof, at least accurately describes how the world feels. Now, there's an interesting parallel between Mesopotamian divine hierarchies and other ancient pantheons that's worth exploring. The Greek Olympians are organized similarly, with Zeus as king, various siblings and children handling different domains, and occasional assemblies to debate important matters. The Norse gods have the Aesir and Vanir, two groups of deities who were once at war but eventually merged, with Odin presiding over the combined pantheon. The Vedic gods of ancient India are organized into complex hierarchies with Indra, Varuna, Agni, and others representing different cosmic forces. Even early Canaanite religion, before the development of Israelite monotheism, featured El presiding over a divine council. This cross-cultural pattern suggests something fundamental about how humans conceptualize divinity and power. We organize gods the way we organize ourselves, projecting our social structures onto the cosmic order. Which raises an interesting question. Are we made in the image of the gods, or are the gods made in our image? The mainstream scholarly answer is the latter. Gods reflect human concerns, human psychology, human social organization. The fringe answer is the former. We're made in the image of our alien creators, and our organizational structures reflect theirs. I'll let you decide which explanation requires fewer assumptions and better fits the available evidence, but I think we both know where this is going. Scholarly debates about the divine assembly also touch on its relationship to kingship ideology. The Mesopotamian king was understood as the earthly representative of the divine order, appointed by the gods to maintain cosmic order on earth. When a king sits on his throne, he's mirroring Enlil's throne in heaven. When he promulgates laws, he's echoing divine decrees. When he conquers other cities, he's enacting the will of the divine assembly. This isn't just propaganda, though it certainly is propaganda. It's a coherent worldview in which earthly and divine realms are intimately connected, with the king serving as the crucial link between them. Some scholars emphasize the cynical political utility of this ideology. It's very convenient for kings to claim divine sanction for their rule. Other scholars emphasize its genuine religious significance. People really believed this stuff, and the king's religious duties were just as important as his military or administrative functions. Both things can be true simultaneously, which is why reducing historical phenomena to single causes is usually a mistake. Power and belief, politics and religion, material interests and spiritual convictions, they're all tangled together, and trying to separate them distorts the historical reality. As this section winds down, imagine yourself leaving the temple complex at Nippur, walking through the narrow streets of the city as evening falls. You pass merchants closing their shops, workers heading home from the fields, children playing in the dusty streets. Everyone you pass lives within the framework of the divine hierarchy we've been discussing. The gods aren't abstract theological concepts to them, they're real presences, real powers that need to be respected, appeased, honored. If the barley crop fails, it's because Enlil withheld rain. If a woman conceives a child, it's because Inanna blessed her. If a king wins a battle, it's because the divine assembly decreed his victory. This worldview isn't primitive or superstitious. It's a coherent way of making sense of a world where natural forces seem capricious, where suffering seems arbitrary, where power seems divinely ordained. We moderns have different explanatory frameworks. We talk about weather patterns instead of storm gods, about fertility medicine instead of goddess blessings, about military strategy instead of divine favor, but we're still trying to do the same thing the Sumerians were doing: make sense of existence, find meaning in chaos, construct narratives that help us navigate the terrifying complexity of being alive. The tools change, the project remains constant. We arrive now at the heart of the mystery, the question that has puzzled scholars, inspired myths, and launched 1,000 fringe theories. Why were humans created? What is our purpose in the cosmic order according to these ancient texts? The Mesopotamian answer is startlingly pragmatic, almost comically utilitarian, and completely lacking in the grand cosmic significance that later religious traditions would attribute to humanity. According to the Atrahasis epic, one of the most important Mesopotamian creation myths, humans were created because the gods were tired of working. Specifically, the Igigi, the younger, lesser gods, were exhausted from maintaining the world, digging irrigation canals, producing food, doing all the labor necessary to keep the cosmic machinery running, so they went on strike. Yes, you read that correctly. The first recorded labor dispute in human literature is divine, and it's resolved not through negotiation, but through the creation of a new servant class, us. The Igigi refuse to work anymore. They throw down their tools. They march to Enlil's palace and threaten revolution. Enlil initially wants to punish them, but Enki, the clever god of wisdom, proposes an alternative solution: create humans to do the work instead. Problem solved, labor dispute resolved, and humanity enters the scene not as the pinnacle of creation, but as scab labor crossing a divine picket line. Here's our mainstream historical fact for this section. The Atrahasis epic is a genuine Akkadian text from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, though it draws on earlier Sumerian traditions. Multiple copies have been found, and scholars like W.G. Lambert have produced definitive editions and translations. The text describes the creation of humanity from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, usually identified as Wi'ilu or Geshtu-i, a god sacrificed specifically to provide the divine element in human nature. This creation narrative serves several functions. It explains why humans must work, we were made for labor, why we're mortal, we're made from clay, and why we have consciousness and will, we contain divine blood. It's a theodicy, an explanation for why suffering exists, and it's remarkably honest about it. We suffer and toil, not because we sinned or fell from grace, but because we were designed to suffer and toil. We're tools, created by gods who needed tools. There's something almost refreshing about this blunt instrumentality, especially compared to later traditions that insist human suffering must serve some grand redemptive purpose. The fringe interpretation, predictably, reads this as literal history. Extraterrestrial beings needed a labor force to mine gold or perform other tasks on Earth, so they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their DNA with that of Homo erectus or some other hominid species. Zecharia Sitchin's entire theoretical edifice rests on this reading. The Anunnaki came to Earth seeking gold to repair their planet's atmosphere. Sure, why not? They initially did the mining themselves. Their workers rebelled, as workers do, so they created humans through genetic engineering to replace themselves. This theory has to ignore basically all of biology, genetics, paleontology, and archaeology, but it makes for compelling storytelling, which is probably why it's so popular. The problem is that human evolution is well documented through fossil evidence, genetic analysis, comparative anatomy, and biogeography. We didn't suddenly appear 200,000 years ago as a genetic hybrid. We evolved gradually over millions of years through natural selection, with clear transitional forms, geographic distribution patterns, and genetic continuity with other primates. The idea that we're genetically engineered hybrids requires throwing out all of this evidence or explaining it away through elaborate ad hoc hypotheses, which is possible but not intellectually satisfying if you actually care about evidence. The scholarly debate here centers on the social and ideological functions of creation myths. Why does the Atrahasis epic present humanity as created for labor? Klaus Wilke and others have argued that this reflects the realities of Bronze Age Mesopotamian economy, which was heavily dependent on corvée labor, state-organized forced labor for public works projects. Ordinary people spent significant portions of their lives digging canals, building walls, maintaining temples, all at the command of kings and priests. The myth naturalizes this arrangement. You work because that's what humans are for. It's not oppression, it's cosmic order. Other scholars, like Jean Bottero, emphasize the theological sophistication of making humans from clay and divine blood. We're simultaneously earthly, clay, mortal, limited, and divine, conscious, willful, capable of relationship with gods. This dual nature explains the human condition. We're capable of divine thoughts but trapped in mortal bodies. We can imagine eternity but we must die. We can create meaning but we're subject to meaningless suffering. It's actually quite profound if you sit with it. This idea that we're walking contradictions, matter animated by spirit, dust infused with divinity. Let's set the scene. You're in a temple courtyard in Babylon, around 1700 BCE. It's evening, and a group of scribes and priests are reciting the Atrahasis epic as part of some religious ceremony. The text is being chanted rather than simply read. There's rhythm and musicality to it, though of course we can't know exactly how it sounded since we don't have recordings from the 18th century BCE, which is a shame because I would absolutely listen to ancient Mesopotamian sacred music while falling asleep if it were available. The priests recite the story of the gods' labor, the Igigi revolt, the decision to create humans. The audience, a mix of temple officials, wealthy donors, and perhaps some educated citizens, listens in respectful silence. They know this story already, they've heard it many times, but hearing it recited in the sacred space of the temple, in the formal language of ritual, gives it weight and authority. This isn't just a story, it's sacred truth, the revealed account of human origins, the explanation for why their lives are shaped the way they are. The creation process itself is fascinating in its concrete details. Enki instructs the mother goddess Nintu, also called Mami or Belet Ili in various texts, to mix clay with the blood of the slain god We-Ilu. The clay represents earthly materiality. We're made from the same stuff as pots and bricks. We'll return to dust when we die. The divine blood represents consciousness, intelligence, the capacity for thought and speech and relationship. Nintu takes this mixture and shapes 14 humans, 7 male, 7 female. The number 14 is significant in Mesopotamian numerology, possibly relating to lunar cycles. The moon waxes for 14 days, wanes for 14 days. These first humans are then used as templates, with each mother goddess shaping additional humans from clay while speaking incantations over them, its creation through craft, through the combination of material and spirit, through divine speech that activates and animates matter. There are obvious parallels to Genesis 2, where God forms Adam from dust and breathes life into him. Both texts imagine creation as a kind of divine pottery combined with animation through breath or blood or speech. Now, the Atrahasis epic doesn't end with the creation of humans. It continues with the story of human population growth, divine annoyance at human noise, and eventually the decision to send a flood to destroy humanity. But we should linger on the creation itself for a moment, because it reveals something important about Mesopotamian anthropology, their understanding of what humans are. We're not created in God's image as bearers of inherent dignity. That's a later biblical innovation. We're not fallen angels or divine souls trapped in matter. That's Gnostic and Platonic thinking. We're literally manufactured beings, products of divine technology, created for a specific purpose. Our value derives from our function, not from any inherent quality. We matter to the gods insofar as we're useful to them. When we become too numerous or too noisy or too troublesome, the gods consider eliminating us and starting over. It's a harsh view of human nature and human value, but it's also curiously realistic. It acknowledges that we're vulnerable, dependent, mortal, and that our continued existence isn't guaranteed by cosmic benevolence but depends on our ability to serve the powers that be. The fringe interpretation loves to focus on phrases like mixing and creation as evidence of genetic engineering, but the text is pretty clearly describing pottery making. You mix clay with water, or in this case, divine blood. You shape it into forms. You activate those forms through ritual speech. It's craft language, not laboratory language. The Mesopotamians were expert potters, expert sculptors, expert craftspeople who worked in clay, metal, and stone. Of course, they imagined divine creation using the same technological metaphors they used in their own creative work. When God creates Adam from dust in Genesis, we don't imagine literal divine hands molding a mud sculpture. We understand it as metaphorical language for creation. But for some reason, when the Atrahasis epic describes creation from clay and blood, fringe theorists read it as a literal description of genetic engineering. The double standard is interesting. Biblical creation is metaphor, but Mesopotamian creation is literal history. This selective literalism is characteristic of fringe theories. They read ancient texts literally when it supports their theories and metaphorically when it doesn't. Scholarly debates about the Atrahasis epic often focus on its relationship to other creation narratives, particularly the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and the biblical Genesis. All three texts share common elements. Divine speech creates or commands. Humans are made from earth mixed with something divine. Blood in Atrahasis, spit and clay in Enuma Elish, breath and dust in Genesis. Creation serves a purpose. Labor in Mesopotamian texts, relationship in Genesis. The mainstream consensus is that these texts share a common cultural and literary heritage, with later texts borrowing, adapting, and transforming earlier ones. The Israelites were exposed to Mesopotamian culture during the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE, and Genesis shows clear influences from Mesopotamian mythology, though transformed through monotheistic theology. The priestly creation account in Genesis 1 might even be deliberately countering the Mesopotamian view. Humans aren't created for divine labor, they're created as God's image-bearers, given dominion and blessing. It's the same basic story structure, but with radically different theological content. There's another text we should mention here, the Enuma Elish, sometimes called the Babylonian creation epic, which offers a slightly different version of human creation. In this version, Marduk, the Babylonian king of the gods, defeats Tiamat, the primordial chaos dragon, in cosmic battle, uses her corpse to create the world, and then creates humans from the blood of Chingu, Tiamat's consort and military commander, specifically so humans can perform the service of the gods and the gods can be at leisure. Again, it's creation for labor, creation as solution to a divine problem. But notice the political subtext. Marduk creates humans after establishing himself as supreme king of the gods. Human creation is one of his kingly acts, demonstrating his power and wisdom. The Enuma Elish was recited during the Babylonian New Year festival when the king's authority was ritually renewed. The myth legitimizes both divine and earthly kingship. Marduk rules the gods, the king rules humans, and both rule for the same reason, to maintain order against chaos. The myth doesn't just explain human origins, it sanctifies political power. Let's talk about the practical implications of this theology for ordinary Mesopotamians. If you're a farmer in ancient Sumer, working in the fields from dawn to dusk, paying taxes to the temple and the palace, performing corvée labor on state projects several months a year, how does the Atrahasis myth affect your understanding of your life? On one hand, it could be oppressive. You're literally created to labor, so resistance is futile. Your suffering is cosmic destiny. On the other hand, it could be oddly empowering. Your work has cosmic significance. You're performing the function for which you were designed. Your labor maintains the divine order. Religion can legitimate oppression, but it can also provide dignity and meaning to lives that might otherwise seem meaningless. A farmer might find genuine comfort in believing that his backbreaking work in the fields isn't just economic necessity, but cosmic duty, service to the gods, participation in the maintenance of order. Is this false consciousness, ideology that makes people complicit in their own exploitation? Sure, probably, but it's also meaning-making, dignity creation, the transformation of necessity into virtue. Both things are true, and reducing it to either just oppression or genuine spirituality misses the complexity. The fringe theories about human creation often ignore this social and cultural context in favor of focusing on supposed technological details. But context is everything when interpreting ancient texts. The Atrahasis epic wasn't written in isolation. It was part of a larger religious system, performed in specific ritual contexts, embedded in a particular social order. Reading it as a neutral historical document, recording alien genetic engineering, strips away all of this context and treats it as if it were a modern scientific report. But ancient texts aren't scientific reports. They're literature, theology, ideology, poetry, propaganda, wisdom, and yes, sometimes history, all woven together in complex ways. You can't just extract one thread and ignore the rest without losing the meaning of the whole fabric. Now, there's a genuinely interesting philosophical question embedded in these creation myths. What is the relationship between purpose and value? If humans were created for a purpose, labor, does that mean we only have value insofar as we fulfill that purpose? This is actually a live question in contemporary philosophy of mind and ethics. Functionalists argue that mental states are defined by their functional roles. Pain is whatever plays the pain role, belief is whatever plays the belief role, etc. Teleologists argue that the purpose of a thing determines its nature. The purpose of a knife is to cut, so a good knife is one that cuts well. If humans have a purpose, even if it's just divine labor, does that mean human value and human flourishing consist in fulfilling that purpose? The Mesopotamians seem to think so. Modern liberal philosophy emphatically rejects this. Humans have intrinsic dignity independent of function or purpose. We're ends in ourselves, not means to others' ends, but interestingly, we still struggle with questions of meaning and purpose. What's the point of my life? What should I do with my time? These are essentially questions about purpose, and the fact that we keep asking them suggests we haven't fully escaped the intuition that purpose and value are connected. As this section draws to a close, imagine the ritual recitation in the Babylonian temple concluding. The priests finish the final lines, describing how humans multiplied and filled the earth, how they began to serve the gods through sacrifice and temple service. The audience sits in contemplative silence for a moment before the ritual concludes, and people begin to disperse. Outside the temple, ordinary life continues. Merchants haggling in the markets, workers laboring in the workshops, children playing in the streets. All of them are living out the cosmic purpose described in the myth, whether they realize it or not. They work, they serve, they maintain the social and cosmic order, and tomorrow they'll wake up and do it again, because that's what humans do, what humans have always done, what humans were made to do, according to the myth at least. Whether there's any truth to the myth beyond its social and psychological functions is ultimately unprovable. Did gods actually create us? Did aliens engineer us? Did we evolve through natural selection? Each explanation has its adherents, its evidence, its philosophical implications, but lying here in the dark, drifting towards sleep, perhaps the truth that matters most isn't about how we got here, but about what we do now that we're here, how we create meaning in our brief existence, how we find dignity and purpose, even if, especially if, the universe doesn't care about us. We arrive now at the crucial connection between divine and earthly power, the ideology that justified kingship for millennia and that continues to echo in political discourse even today. The divine right of kings, or in Mesopotamian terms, the descent of kingship from heaven. The Sumerian king list, which we discussed earlier, begins with a remarkable statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. Not kingship was invented, or the first king ruled, but kingship descended from heaven. This is a crucial ideological claim. Kingship isn't a human institution arising from practical necessity or social contract. It's a divine gift, a cosmic principle, an element of the fundamental order of reality. Before there were kings on earth, kingship existed in heaven as a divine attribute. When it was time for human civilization to begin, the gods decided to extend kingship to earth, choosing specific cities and specific rulers to receive this sacred responsibility. Every king who ever ruled in Mesopotamia, whether in Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Babylon, or any other city-state, claimed to rule by this divine mandate, to be the earthly representative of the heavenly order, to exercise authority that ultimately derived not from military power or popular consent, but from divine choice. Here's our mainstream historical fact for this section. Kingship ideology in ancient Mesopotamia was indeed understood as divinely ordained, with kings performing crucial religious functions as intermediaries between gods and humans. Extensive textual and archaeological evidence confirms this. Royal inscriptions describe kings as chosen by specific gods. Ritual texts prescribe ceremonies in which kings are symbolically married to goddesses or reenact divine myths. Administrative documents show that temples and palaces were intimately connected institutions. Scholars like Mark van der Meerup and Piotr Michalowski have documented how Mesopotamian kingship combined religious, military, and administrative functions in ways that make modern separation of church and state nearly incomprehensible. The king wasn't just a political leader, he was the chief priest, the supreme judge, the commander of armies, and the steward of the gods' earthly estates. His legitimacy rested entirely on his claim to divine election, and maintaining that claim required constant religious performance, building and maintaining temples, performing daily rituals, celebrating festivals, making appropriate sacrifices. The fringe interpretation, as you might expect, reads, kingship descended from heaven, literally, alien rulers physically descended from spacecraft to establish the first governments, and subsequent kings were either aliens themselves, hybrid alien-human offspring, or human puppets of extraterrestrial overlords. This theory often gets entangled with ideas about bloodlines and genetics. If the first kings were aliens or hybrids, then royal bloodlines preserve alien DNA, which supposedly explains why royalty has historically married within narrow circles to preserve the alien genetic heritage. It's elaborate, it's creative, and it requires ignoring what we actually know about the development of kingship, which emerged gradually from earlier forms of social organization like chiefdoms and big man systems, which themselves emerged from egalitarian band societies. We can trace this development archaeologically. Settlements get larger, social hierarchies become more complex, specialized roles emerge, monumental architecture appears, eventually centralized authority coalesces around specific individuals who claim special status. It's a process, not an event, and it definitely doesn't require alien intervention. The scholarly debate in this area focuses on questions about the relationship between religious ideology and political reality. How much did Mesopotamian kings actually believe their own propaganda? Were they cynical manipulators using religion to control the masses? Or were they true believers who genuinely saw themselves as divine representatives? The answer, as usual, is probably both, and it depends. Some kings were likely more devout than others. Some probably wrestled with doubt while maintaining public piety. Some perhaps oscillated between genuine belief and cynical instrumentalism depending on circumstances. Joan Goodnick-Westenholz has argued that we shouldn't understand Mesopotamian kingship ideology as simply false or manipulative. For the people who lived within this system, including the kings themselves, it was simply reality. The king really was chosen by the gods, in the same way that the sun really did rise each morning because Shamash drove his chariot across the sky. It wasn't metaphor or manipulation, it was how the world worked. Picture yourself in ancient Uruk, around 2700 BCE, during the reign of Gilgamesh. Yes, that Gilgamesh, the legendary hero king who later became the protagonist of the most famous epic poem in Mesopotamian literature. Historical records suggest a real King Gilgamesh ruled Uruk in the early dynastic period, though the epic tales about fighting monsters and seeking immortality are obviously later elaborations. You're standing in a crowd of thousands gathered in the temple courtyard to witness Gilgamesh's sacred marriage to Inanna. This is a ritual performed annually, in which the king symbolically marries the goddess, ensuring fertility for the land and prosperity for the city. The king, dressed in ceremonial robes and wearing the royal crown, approaches the temple. Inside, a priestess representing Inanna awaits. The actual details of the sacred marriage are private, but everyone understands what's happening. The king is uniting himself with divine power, renewing his mandate to rule, demonstrating his special status as the one human worthy to approach the goddess intimately. The crowd watches in reverent silence as the king disappears into the temple. You're surrounded by the smell of incense, roasted meat from sacrifices, human sweat in the hot sun. Children fidget and whisper until their parents shush them. Old people stand solemnly, having witnessed this ceremony dozens of times. Young people watch with wide eyes, awed by the sacred spectacle. This isn't just theatre, though it certainly is theatre. This is the confirmation and renewal of the cosmic order. The king's union with Inanna ensures that the rains will come, the crops will grow, the city will prosper. His rule is legitimate because the goddess accepts him. If the crops fail, if the city suffers, if enemies attack, these become evidence that the king has lost divine favor, that his legitimacy is in question, that perhaps a new king needs to be chosen. The ritual isn't empty ceremony, it's the mechanism by which political authority is created, maintained, and potentially challenged. Now, the descent of kingship from heaven isn't just about individual kings, it's about the institution of kingship itself as a civilizing force. The Mesopotamian worldview held that before kingship there was chaos. City-states fought each other constantly. There was no law, no order, no justice. Kingship brings civilization. The king establishes laws, maintains irrigation systems, organizes defense, builds temples, ensures justice. This ideology appears in texts like the prologue to Hammurabi's Law Code, where Hammurabi claims that the gods chose him to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Is this propaganda? Sure. Did Hammurabi actually prevent the strong from oppressing the weak? Debatable. But it's also a coherent political philosophy. Legitimate authority serves justice, protects the vulnerable, maintains order. A king who fails in these duties is a bad king, potentially subject to divine punishment or human rebellion. The fringe interpretations focus on individual details that can be read as supporting the alien theory. Kings claim to be chosen by gods who descended from heaven. See aliens. Kings sometimes claim semi-divine parentage. See hybrid genetics. Kings perform mysterious rituals in temple sanctuaries. See secret alien technology. But this selective reading ignores the broader context of ancient kingship ideology, which is remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. Egyptian pharaohs were divine. Chinese emperors had the mandate of heaven. Japanese emperors were descended from the sun goddess. Mesoamerican rulers mediated between earthly and divine realms. European kings ruled by divine right. The cross-cultural consistency suggests this isn't evidence of ancient alien intervention, but evidence of a common human psychological tendency. Authority needs legitimation, and the most powerful form of legitimation is claiming that authority comes from beyond human society, from the divine or cosmic order itself. It's ideology as social technology, and it's remarkably effective because it's difficult to argue against. How do you prove the gods didn't choose the king? Scholarly work on Mesopotamian kingship often emphasizes the gap between ideology and reality. Royal inscriptions present an idealized image. The king is wise, just, pious, victorious in battle, beloved by gods and people. Archaeological and administrative evidence reveals a messier reality. Kings fought losing battles, faced rebellions, dealt with economic crises, struggled to maintain control. The gap between the ideal and the real is interesting because it shows what the culture valued. A good king should be all those idealized things, even if no actual king fully achieved the ideal. The ideology sets standards that can be used to judge and criticize actual rulers. This is important because it means kingship ideology isn't simply a tool of oppression, it also creates expectations that rulers must meet or at least appear to meet, which constrains their behavior in certain ways. Let's talk about succession, because this is where divine right theory gets complicated. If kingship is divinely ordained, how do you determine who should be king next? Mesopotamian practice varied across time and place. Sometimes kingship passed from father to son, primogeniture, the oldest son inherits. Sometimes a king would designate his successor while still alive. Sometimes a council of elders or assembly of citizens might choose. Sometimes military leaders would seize power and then claim divine sanction retroactively. The king list presents succession as orderly. One dynasty ends, another begins. Kingship moves from city to city in an orderly progression. But historical reality was much more chaotic, with rival claimants, civil wars, disputed successions. The ideology had to be flexible enough to accommodate this chaos while maintaining the principle that whoever ended up ruling was divinely chosen. It's a neat rhetorical trick. If you win, that proves the gods chose you. If you lose, that proves they didn't. The gods always support the winner, which is very convenient for whoever happens to be winning at any given moment. There's a fascinating text called the Sumerian Temple Hymns, attributed to the priestess Enheduanna, daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, around 2300 BCE, which provides insight into how royal women participated in the religious legitimation of kingship. Enheduanna was appointed as high priestess of the moon god Nanna in a position that combined religious authority with political significance. Her hymns praise various temples and their gods, but they also subtly reinforce her father's political authority by demonstrating the royal family's piety and divine connections. Royal women in Mesopotamia weren't passive. They were often priestesses, administrators of estates, participants in diplomacy. Their religious roles were crucial to maintaining the family's divine mandate. This complicates the simple king rules by divine right story. It's actually a family affair, with multiple members performing different religious and political functions to maintain collective authority. The fringe alien theories tend to focus exclusively on male rulers, ignoring the complex gender dynamics of ancient kingship. But if we're taking the text seriously, which fringe theories claim to do, we should notice that goddesses are just as important as gods in many of these narratives, and priestesses like Enheduanna exercise real authority. The alien interpretation typically imagines patriarchal extraterrestrial hierarchies, but actual Mesopotamian religion features powerful goddesses and influential female religious figures. This suggests that what we're seeing isn't alien governance structures, but human social structures being projected onto divine realms and then reflected back to legitimize earthly authority. Scholarly debates also address the question of how kingship ideology evolved over time. Early Sumerian city-states seem to have had more collective governance, with councils and assemblies playing significant roles alongside kings. As states grew larger and more complex, kingship became more autocratic, more divine, more absolute. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon and Naram-Sin saw kings claiming increasingly grandiose titles and divine status. Later, Babylonian and Assyrian kings moderated these claims somewhat, positioning themselves as servants of the gods rather than gods themselves, though still divinely chosen and specially favored. The evolution reflects changing political circumstances and theological developments, demonstrating that even supposedly eternal divine truths shift in response to historical pressures. As we conclude this section, imagine Gilgamesh emerging from the temple after the sacred marriage ceremony. The crowd erupts in cheers and chants. The king raises his hands in blessing, and people bow in reverence. Tomorrow he'll return to the mundane work of governance, settling disputes, planning irrigation projects, preparing defenses against rival cities. But for this moment, he's more than human, more than king. He's the living link between heaven and earth, the guarantor of cosmic order, the chosen one of the gods. Whether this is truth or performance or some complex mixture of both is almost beside the point. What matters is that everyone present believes it, participates in it, finds meaning in it. The spectacle creates reality. By performing divine kingship, the king becomes divine, at least in the functional sense that his authority is recognized, his commands are obeyed, his person is sacred. And tomorrow, when ordinary people return to their ordinary work, they'll do so within a framework of meaning that places their labor, their obedience, their suffering within a cosmic context that makes it bearable, even meaningful. Is this liberation or oppression? Probably both. Is it truth or ideology? Probably both. History is complicated, and anyone who offers simple answers is probably selling something. And so we find ourselves here, at the end of our journey through the ancient texts and the modern interpretations, through the cuneiform tablets and the scholarly debates, through the mainstream consensus and the fringe alternatives. We began in a Sumerian temple with clay still soft under a scribe's fingers, recording stories about gods descending from heaven to organize the chaos into cosmos. We traveled through the antediluvian age, that mythological prehistory where kings allegedly ruled for tens of thousands of years, where time itself operated differently, where the boundary between human and divine was more permeable than it would ever be again. We examined the divine hierarchy, the Anunnaki in all their bureaucratic glory, organized into councils and assemblies that looked suspiciously like the political structures of the humans who invented them. We wrestled with the question of human creation, the uncomfortable idea that we might be cosmic servants, manufactured beings designed for labor, bearing divine consciousness in mortal clay. We explored the ideology of kingship, that peculiar but persistent notion that political authority flows from heaven, that some humans are chosen by gods to rule over others, that the social order mirrors and participates in the cosmic order. Throughout this journey, we've encountered two fundamentally different ways of reading ancient texts. The mainstream scholarly approach treats these texts as products of their time and place, as human attempts to make meaning in a confusing world, as literature and theology and ideology woven together in complex ways. This approach uses archaeology, linguistics, comparative mythology, and historical context to understand what these texts meant to the people who wrote them and the cultures that preserved them. It finds them rich and fascinating, not because they're literally true historical accounts, but because they reveal how ancient people thought about existence, divinity, power, meaning, and mortality. The fringe approach, by contrast, reads these texts as encoded historical documents, as records of actual events involving extraterrestrial beings whose technology and presence were misunderstood as divine by primitive humans. This approach selectively literalizes ancient metaphors, ignores cultural and linguistic context, and explains away contradictory evidence through elaborate hypotheses about ancient conspiracies and modern academic suppression. Which approach is correct? Well, that depends on what you mean by correct. If you mean which approach better fits the available evidence, uses more rigorous methodology, and requires fewer assumptions, then the mainstream scholarly consensus wins handily. If you mean which approach is more exciting, imaginative, and psychologically satisfying for people who want to believe we're not alone in the universe and that ancient civilizations achieved things beyond our current understanding, then the fringe theories have their appeal. But truth isn't a popularity contest, and excitement isn't evidence. The ancient Mesopotamians created something extraordinary: the first cities, the first writing systems, the first law codes, the first epic literature, the first scientific astronomy, the first mathematics beyond simple counting. They did this not because aliens helped them, but because humans are clever, creative, cooperative, and capable of remarkable achievements when we pool our efforts and build on accumulated knowledge. Attributing their accomplishments to extraterrestrial intervention doesn't honor them, it diminishes them. But let's be honest, the fringe theories are addressing real human needs and asking real questions, even if their answers are unconvincing. Why do we exist? What's our purpose? Are we alone in the universe? Did ancient people know things we've forgotten? Is there hidden wisdom in old texts that mainstream scholarship ignores? These are legitimate questions, and the fact that people seek answers in ancient astronaut theories or alternative archaeology suggests that mainstream science and scholarship aren't fully meeting certain psychological and spiritual needs. Maybe that's okay. Not all needs should be met through empirical inquiry. Poetry, philosophy, religion, art, myth. These domains address questions that science can't answer, questions about meaning and value and purpose. The problem arises when we confuse domains, when we try to extract scientific truth from mythological narratives, or when we dismiss myth as just false belief rather than recognizing its distinct functions and values. The Sumerian texts we've explored tonight encode genuine wisdom, but it's not wisdom about extraterrestrial biology or ancient technology. It's wisdom about the human condition. We're conscious beings in mortal bodies, capable of both creation and destruction. subject to powers beyond our control, desperate for meaning in what often seems like a meaningless universe. The Anunnaki myths address these perennial concerns through stories about gods who are remarkably human, petty, ambitious, capable of both cruelty and kindness, struggling with the same basic problems humans struggle with. These gods work, get tired, go on strike, need servants, make mistakes, regret their decisions, and try to fix things through various schemes that often backfire. They're not the distant, transcendent, perfect deity of classical monotheism. They're immanent, messy, relatable. And maybe that's exactly what the Sumerians needed. Gods who understood labor and exhaustion. Gods who made mistakes and had to live with consequences. Gods who were powerful but not omnipotent, complex but not incomprehensible. What strikes me most, reflecting on these texts and the cultures that produced them, is their honesty about suffering and limitation. The Mesopotamians didn't sugarcoat the human condition. We're made from clay and divine blood. We're simultaneously earthly and transcendent, limited and conscious of our limits. We work because that's what we were made for. There's no promise that labor will be rewarding or that suffering serves some grand redemptive purpose. We die because we're mortal. There's no afterlife of reward or punishment, just the grim underworld where everyone ends up regardless of how they lived. The gods are powerful but capricious. You can sacrifice and pray and obey and still suffer, because divine favor is uncertain and cosmic justice is not guaranteed. It's a bleak worldview in some respects, but it's also oddly freeing. If there's no cosmic purpose to your suffering, then you don't have to justify it or find meaning in it. If the gods are capricious, then bad things happening to you aren't necessarily your fault. If death is inevitable and impartial, then at least it's not divine punishment for your failures. Modern people often struggle with this kind of acceptance. We want suffering to mean something, want our lives to have cosmic significance, want to believe that justice will prevail eventually, even if not in our lifetimes. The Mesopotamians, at least in their official theology, made no such promises. And yet they built great cities, created beautiful art, developed sophisticated science and mathematics, wrote moving poetry, and found ways to live meaningful lives within the framework of this relatively pessimistic cosmology. Maybe there's a lesson there. Meaning doesn't require cosmic validation. You can live well, create beauty, pursue wisdom, love other people, and find satisfaction in work, even if the universe doesn't care about you, even if the gods are unreliable, even if death is final. Maybe autonomy and meaning-making are connected. If the gods don't give you purpose, you have to create your own, which is harder, but also more authentic. The scholarly debates we've touched on throughout this narrative, about textual interpretation, about the development of religion and kingship, about the relationship between myth and history, these aren't just academic arguments. They're part of humanity's ongoing conversation with itself about who we are and how we know what we know. Every generation has to interpret the past anew, has to decide what ancient texts mean for contemporary concerns, has to balance respect for tradition with critical inquiry. The Sumerians are long gone, but their texts remain, and each era finds different meanings in them. The Babylonians read Sumerian myths and saw theological truths. Medieval Islamic scholars preserved Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge. Victorian archaeologists excavated the ruins and created museums. Mid-20th century scholars established Assyriology as a rigorous academic discipline. Late 20th century alternative theorists reimagined the Anunnaki as aliens. Early 21st century audiences listen to podcasts about ancient mysteries while falling asleep. We're all reading the same texts, but we're all reading them through our own cultural lenses, finding what we need or want to find, sometimes discovering genuine insights, and sometimes just projecting our own concerns onto ancient material. What will future generations make of these texts? If human civilization survives another few thousand years, will scholars in 6000 CE study Sumerian mythology the way we do? Will they understand our scholarly debates, our fringe theories, our different ways of seeking meaning? Will they look at our civilization, our cities, our technologies, our texts, and construct narratives about us that we wouldn't recognize? Will they have their own fringe theorists claiming that we were visited by time travelers, or that our technological achievements prove we had help from higher dimensional beings? The humbling truth is that we're no better at understanding our own time than the Sumerians were at understanding theirs. We see patterns, construct narratives, build explanatory frameworks, but we're always working with partial information, interpreting through cultural lenses, finding meanings that might say more about us than about the reality we're trying to understand. And now, as you lie there in the darkness, feeling sleep approaching like a quiet tide, consider what we've accomplished together tonight. We've traveled back 5,000 years, explored texts written in a language that was dead before Rome existed, grappled with questions about divinity and humanity and meaning that have occupied humans since we first developed the cognitive capacity to ask them. We've encountered mainstream scholarship and fringe alternatives, ancient scribes and modern theorists, gods and kings and ordinary people trying to make sense of existence. We've learned some history, some archaeology, some linguistics, some theology, some philosophy, all woven together into a narrative designed to be both informative and soporific, educational and relaxing. The Anunnaki, whether gods or aliens or psychological projections or literary constructs or some complex mixture of all these things, have served their purpose tonight. They've given us a framework for exploring human meaning-making, for thinking about how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. Tomorrow, when you wake, they'll return to wherever ancient gods reside when not being discussed in bedtime histories, in archives and museums, in academic journals, in fringe websites, in the deep structures of Western consciousness that inherited so much from Mesopotamian civilization, whether we realize it or not. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed tonight's exploration, please consider subscribing. I create these narratives regularly, covering various historical topics, always with the same gentle approach designed to inform while helping you drift into sleep. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you find mainstream or fringe interpretations more compelling? What other ancient mysteries would you like explored? What helps you sleep? Detailed historical analysis, the rhythm of continuous narrative, the gentle deflation of outlandish theories, or just the sound of a voice in the darkness making the world seem a little less empty and incomprehensible? Close your eyes now. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress, the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blankets. Your breathing slows naturally. Your thoughts drift like clouds across an ancient sky, like reeds bending in the wind along the Euphrates, like clay dust settling after the day's work. Somewhere, in some museum archive, a Sumerian tablet sits in a climate-controlled case, its cuneiform signs still legible after 5 millennia, waiting for the next scholar to read it, the next student to study it, the next curious mind to wonder about the people who wrote it and what they believed and why it still matters. But that can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, you've done enough wondering, enough thinking, enough questioning. Tonight, you rest, you drift, you let go. The ancient scribes have finished their work. The gods have returned to their heavens or their spaceships or the human imagination that created them. The kings have crumbled to dust, their grand palaces eroded by wind and time, their mighty armies forgotten, their elaborate ideologies reduced to fragmentary texts requiring expert translation. But the questions remain, as eternal as human consciousness itself. Why are we here? What should we do? What does it mean? And perhaps the Sumerians, for all their alien gods and impossible chronologies and elaborate cosmologies, understood something we sometimes forget. The questions matter more than the answers, the asking more than the knowing, the humble acknowledgement of mystery more than confident claims of certainty. Sleep well. Dream of ancient cities if you dream at all. And remember that you're part of an unbroken chain of human consciousness, stretching back to those first scribes in Uruk, forward to whatever strange future awaits our species, all of us asking the same questions in different languages, building the same meanings from different materials, telling ourselves stories in the dark to make the night less frightening and the morning more bearable. End of script. Sweet dreams. V.